I rarely correct my good friend Jack, but I feel compelled to do so. The way he put it, he said, "We got sick." It was actually, "We're stuck with sick." So I wanted to clarify that. This is my last one. I was telling Jack before we started here that I look around, I see people that have come to just about everyone or just about everyone. And I see people, I told Jack, it's not, when I get nice big crowds, it's not about ego. It just gives me such great satisfaction knowing that people are interested in history like I am, and they apparently enjoy what I say. That gives me great satisfaction, and for that I thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure for me to be here. So thank you so much. All right, are we ready? First of all, once again, this is a little audience participation. So I'm going to ask you to imagine, if you will, the long, hot summer of 1776. Can you turn these lights on? Or turn them down a little bit, thank you. The long, hot summer of 1776. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, destined to become Independence Hall, 56 men sit in uncomfortable silence, knowing history has narrowed down to a single question: will you sign? To sign is not merely to put ink on parchment. To sign is treason. To sign is to declare war against the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. You're about to risk your fortune. You know, pardon me, I'm sitting here looking and saying, who is the person letting her phone ring like that? So pardon me, I'll start over. You're about to risk your fortune, your home, your reputation, your family, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, your very life. Because once your name is written there, there's no going back. So you hesitate, naturally so. But one man does not. That man rises, walks to the table, lifts the quill, and signs his name so large, so bold, so defiant, that 250 years later, we are still saying his name. Then he boldly declared that King George III could read it without his spectacles. He had been funding the revolution for years. The signature was just the receipt. That man, ladies and gentlemen, was John Hancock. And that signature was the signature of liberty. Yet behind that famous script stood a real man. Vain, generous, brilliant, and astonishingly brave. Who was he? What made him? What kind of man risked everything and signs his name larger than anyone else on the page, 5 bold inches across? Tonight we find out, right here, right now. So let's follow John Hancock from a modest parsonage in Braintree, Massachusetts, to the halls of the Revolution, to the birth of the Republic, and into the private sorrows that shadowed his final years. Ladies and gentlemen, the man behind the signature was every bit as extraordinary as the legend itself. John Hancock was born on January 23rd, 1737 in Braintree, Massachusetts, the same small town that would produce John Adams only a few years later. Somehow, that soil seemed to grow great patriots. John Hancock's father was a humble minister, devout, respected, educated, but far from wealthy. Young John's childhood was ordinary by New England standards: scripture, schoolwork, discipline, and yes, very hard winters. Then everything changed. In 1744, when John was only 7 years old, his father died. That single event altered the course of American history. The Reverend Hancock left little money behind, and Mary Hancock made the difficult decision that many widows of her time were forced to make. She sent young John to Boston to live with his uncle and aunt, Thomas and Lydia Hancock. Thomas Hancock was not merely successful. He was the wealthiest merchant in all of British North America. His fleet of ships crossed the Atlantic. His warehouses crowded the waterfront. His businesses reached London, the Caribbean, and way, way beyond. But he had no son, no heir to carry on his legacy. Until now. Now they had young John. Let us imagine young John Hancock for a moment. A boy from very humble beginnings, arriving at a great mansion on Beacon Hill for the very first time. A frightened 7-year-old boy suddenly surrounded by servants, mahogany furniture, fine silver, Persian rugs, and bookshelves overflowing with volumes that he had never imagined. From his bedroom window above the Boston Commons, young John looked out upon a forest of ships, ships' masts rising and falling with the tide of the Atlantic. Thomas and Lydia Hancock adored the boy. They educated him. They introduced him to Boston society. John attended Boston Latin School, the best school in all of New England. And later Harvard, entering just at 13 years old. After graduation, Thomas Hancock taught him business, shipping, finance, negotiations, and the complicated relationship between commerce and political power. In 1760, Thomas set into London. For a young colonial merchant, it was astonishing. The largest city in the Western world, a city of power, wealth, and yes, empire. Hancock watched royal ceremonies, observed Parliament, moved among the elite society, and returned to Boston polished, competent, and very ambitious. He came home just in time. In 1764, Thomas Hancock died, and everything passed on to John. At 27 years old, John Hancock became the richest man in all of America. The question, therefore, was simple. What would he do with it all? We're about to find out. John Hancock, who emerged in the 1760s, did not look like a revolutionary. He was rich, exceptionally rich. Velvet coats, powdered wigs, silk waistcoats, silver buckles, and he enjoyed every bit of it. He rode through the streets of Boston in a gleaming white carriage drawn by 6 majestic white horses, so perfectly matched, so flawless in their stride, that crowds gathered just to stare. He gave generously to the poor. John Adams estimated that no less than 1,000 families depended on Hancock for their daily bread. He treated his employees exceptionally well. He hosted lavish dinners. Nothing about him suggested rebellion. Yet, beneath the velvet and silver, something dangerous was beginning to grow. Parliament had just made a mistake. A big mistake. After the 7 Years' War, Britain needed money. London looked at the colonies and saw revenue. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, new custom enforcement, new taxations. This threatened his ships, his fortune, his very future. Around this time, Hancock formed a crucial partnership with Samuel Adams, and the two men could not have been more different. Hancock was wealthy, polished, fashionable. Adams was poor, disheveled, a mess, and entirely indifferent to his appearances. But Adams possessed something extraordinary: political genius. He understood public anger, public pressure, public movements. He looked at Hancock and saw money, respectability, and a famous name. Hancock looked at Adams and saw direction. It was Adams who drew Hancock into the Sons of Liberty, the radical network organizing resistance against the British taxation. Together, they became one of the most powerful partnerships of the Revolution. But revolutions require money. John Adams later remarked that Samuel Adams appeared to have none, and Hancock was likely paying all his bills. The man in velvet and silver buckles was quietly financing the resistance. But the British were watching. And what alarmed them most was not Hancock's wealth, it was his popularity. A rich man, the crowd could manage. A radical, they could isolate him. But a rich man loved by the people, that was dangerous. In 1768, ladies and gentlemen, everything changed. One of Hancock's ships, appropriately named the Liberty, arrived in Boston Harbor. British custom officials accused him of smuggling and seized the vessel. Boston erupted. Crowds filled the harbor. Mobs attacked custom officials, pelting them with rocks and ran shacking their properties. The officials fled in fear. Hancock hired a brilliant lawyer and childhood friend to defend him, John Hancock. Adams dismantled the Crown's case. The charges collapsed. They intended to intimidate him. Give me 1 second here, pardon me, I hate this technology. They had intended to intimidate John Hancock. Instead, they transformed him into a symbol of resistance. After the Boston Tea Party, a British officer demanded to know who ordered the destruction of the tea. Nobody in this big crowd would answer. Frustrated, he exploded. It was King Hancock and the Sons of Liberty. King Hancock. Intended as mockery, Boston embraced it as a badge of honor. And after Lexington and Concord, as British soldiers retreated under fire, patriots shouted at the top of their lungs, "King Hancock forever." Tensions between them had been building for months. Small confrontations, insults, shoves. Then on the night of March 5th, 1770, it all broke open. British soldiers fired into a hostile crowd on King Street. 5 colonists died. Samuel Adams branded it as the Boston Massacre. The following year, Hancock delivered the official oration remembering the event. Thousands attended, and standing before them, he spoke words that echoed across the colonies. Some boast of being friends to government. I am a friend to righteous government, to a government founded upon the principles of reason and justice. But I glory in publicly avowing my eternal anonymity to tyranny. This was not a careful statement from a wealthy man protecting his investments. This was a declaration, public and permanent. And everyone knew there was no taking that back. Then came December 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Though Hancock did not personally board the ships that night, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty planned it and executed it with Hancock's money and his blessing. Parliament responded with the coercive acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, a series of punitive laws designed to isolate Massachusetts and reassert British authority, and suddenly resistance spread beyond Boston. By April of 1775, war was fast approaching. General Thomas Gage knew of two of the most influential revolutionaries in Massachusetts, Sam Adams and John Hancock, were staying in Lexington. So on the night of April 18th, British troops marched quietly out of Boston. Their mission: seize the weapons stored at Concord and arrest Hancock and Adams. Then, through the darkness, a rider came. Paul Revere rode through the night, mile after mile, warning after warning, until at last he reached Lexington. Before dawn, John Hancock was awakened. But when he was told that British were coming, Hancock had no desire to flee. If the king wanted him, the king would have to come and take him. He said, "Let them send their armies. They will find not subjects here, but citizens, and armed citizens." Hancock demanded to stay and fight beside the militia on Lexington Green. Others had to restrain him. Finally, Sam Adams told him, "John, we are not meant to die here. We are needed for what comes next." So Hancock left Lexington before sunrise. Hours later, a shot was fired. The shot heard round the world, and the world changed forever. The Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775. Only weeks later, the delegates elected John Hancock president. Back in Boston, meanwhile, he paid a steep price, personal price, for his patriotism. The British seized his mansion and used it as a barracks, leaving it severely damaged. But Hancock never wavered. He said, "I have ships in every harbor, and I would see them all burned before I bend my knee to tyranny." At 38 years old, he became the presiding officer over the revolutionary government. With no established nation, stable finances, formal army, or even hope of victory. However, Hancock proved remarkably effective. He managed debate skillfully, handled enormous egos, correspondence, but still one moment wounded him deeply. When Congress debated who should command the Continental Army, Hancock wanted that position. He made little effort to hide it. Then John Adams rose and nominated George Washington. The room shifted immediately. Hancock was disappointed, painfully so. There is a letter that survives from those weeks. In it, Hancock wrote that he never desired anything in public life so deeply, and that loss left him hollow in a way he could not explain to anyone. He sent it to no one. He never mailed it. He folded it, set it aside, and left it to history. And he went back to work. In the years that followed, he named his only son John George Washington Hancock. He honored the man who had been chosen over him. That's not vanity. That is character, ladies and gentlemen. That is the man behind the signature. Then came June of 1776. Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution for independence by declaring that these united colonies are, and have right ought to be, free and independent states. On July 4th, Congress approved Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Paine wrote, "We have the power to begin the world all over again." They plan to do just that. August 2nd, 1776, the official engrossed parchment of the Declaration of Independence lies on the table. One by one, the delegates step forward, but once again, they hesitate. They knew the risks. They knew the noose was waiting just for them. Now, as President of Congress, it was his job to lead them across the line of no return. John Hancock rises, walks to the table, lifts the quill, and signs his name so large, so bold, so unmistakable that it has never in 250 years been forgotten. Hancock had more to lose than almost anybody in that room. If a revolution failed, his wealth, property, and his life would be gone. Now he was the very face of treason. He accepted that willingly. After the signing, Ben Franklin said, "Now, gentlemen, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." In Boston, crowds gathered at the old State House to hear the words out loud. When the reading ended, they tore the royal lion and unicorn from the building and burned them in the streets. The revolution had become irreversible. In 1777, Hancock resigned from Congress due to illness and exhaustion and returned home. But something else had happened that year. Something devastating. His daughter, Lydia, named for the beloved aunt who had raised him, was gone. She was not yet 1 year old. Hancock had fought for a republic his child would never see. He carried the loss quietly, as men of his era were expected to do. but he carried it. Then joy returned. In 1778, a son was born, John George Washington Hancock. All of Boston called him Johnny. A bright, sweet, very affectionate boy. The pride of a father who had already buried a daughter. The promise of a future the Revolution was supposed to secure. In 1780, the people chose John Hancock as Massachusetts' first governor. He won overwhelmingly, as he did for 9 terms. He understood ceremony in the crowd. As governor, he rode out to meet veterans, opened his Beacon Hill mansion, and appeared at public events with genuine warmth. Not aristocratic distance, but warmth. He was of Boston, not above it. Unlike other founders who were uneasy with the energy of revolution, Hancock fed off the crowds, and they fed off him. He would say to them, "Some men lead with ceremony. I prefer your company." And the war continued. Cold winters, defeats. Yet somehow the revolution survived. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1783, the nation John Hancock had signed into existence was no longer an act of defiance. It was a fact. Then, on a Sunday afternoon in January 1787, Johnny took his skates to a pond in Milton, Massachusetts. He fell on the ice and never recovered from his injuries. He was 8 years old. At 50, crippled with gout, childless and heartbroken beyond belief. But Hancock went on because he had made promises to a republic, to a people, to the dead, that grief did not cancel. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, he went on. He told the people of Boston, "There is a deep satisfaction in knowing we gave everything we could for the good of our country. And no tyrant, no matter how angry or powerful, can ever take that away." Now he had to believe those words for himself. In 1788, the new Constitution faced the gravest threat of its young existence. The war had been won, but the Republic was fracturing. 9 states had to ratify the Constitution for it to take effect. And across the country, Americans were deeply divided. Many feared that a powerful federal government would simply replace one tyranny with another. Massachusetts was one of the critical battlegrounds, and the outcome here would determine whether other states would follow. Hancock knew his endorsement would decide it. He waited. He was seriously ill, politically uncommitted. and both sides courted him desperately. Then he made his decision. As John Hancock entered the chamber, instantly a sacred silence descended upon the assembly. Every eye locked onto the door. The whispering began in one corner of the gallery and swept through the crowded chamber. He has come. It is he. Stunned delegates exchanged glances as chairs scraped across the wooden floors. Men rose as one, their astonishment giving way to silent reverence. It is him indeed, they whispered. The great patriot was barely recognizable, wrapped in heavy blankets, his frail body carried into the room by a solemn procession. Yet despite the weakness of his body, his presence was electric. Then, bracing himself against the arms of his supporters, he fought the gravity of his failing health. Slowly, painfully, he rose. And then he spoke. He proposed a compromise. Ratify the Constitution now, but formally recommend amendments to protect individual liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, protections against unlawful speech, or unlawful search. Because no government in history had ever given those freedoms away. They had to be demanded, written down, made permanent. That compromise changed everything. Massachusetts ratified by a narrow margin. Other states soon followed. And those recommended amendments, ladies and gentlemen, became, as we know today, as our Bill of Rights. Every freedom protected in the Bill of Rights carries within it the fingerprints of John Hancock's compromise in that chamber in 1788. Now he ensured the promise of liberty was permanently written into law. Before he left the convention, he spoke what perhaps the most quietly beautiful words of his public life. He rose once again with the help of friends and supporters. As they held him up, he said, "Thank God, my country is saved." Sorry, let me read all my text. "Thank God, my country is saved, and by the smile of heaven, I am a free and independent man." The final years, ladies and gentlemen, was marked by intense pain. The gout worsened terribly. He could barely rise from his chair. And yet, the people of Massachusetts continued electing him governor again and again and again, 9 times. Why? Because they remembered They remembered what he had risked. They remembered what he had signed. They remembered the governor who showed up to the ratifying convention wrapped in blankets because the public needed him there. By autumn, the hand that had signed his name, largest of all, could barely hold a pen. On October 8th, in the year of our Lord, 1793, John Hancock died at his home, Hancock Manor. He was 56 years old. His body had been consumed by years of public service, illness, and intense, painful grief. He had outlived both of his children. He had outlived the revolution itself and helped build what came after. Boston mourned him massively. He lay in state for a week, with thousands coming to pay their respects. And on the day of burial, some 20,000 people joined the funeral procession. Ladies and gentlemen, that's in a city of barely 25,000. Church bells rang, harbor flags flew at half-mast. Veterans openly wept in the streets. John Adams reflected on their decades of shared history. I can say with truth that I profoundly admired him. And more profoundly, I loved him. Days before he left this world, it has been said that he shared this with his beloved wife, Dolly. The grave asked no man whether he was comfortable. It asked only whether he was free. Hancock died as he wished. He left behind no children to carry his name forward. He left behind a nation instead. John Hancock, ladies and gentlemen, was not a perfect man. He could be vain. He could be calculated. He was sensitive to criticism and hungry for admiration. But history isn't written by saints, now is it? History is forged by flawed men and women who rise magnificently to the moment placed before them. And when Hancock's moment came, he did not shrink. He chose liberty over comfort. He chose revolution over safety. He chose to stand exactly where the enemy could see him. A merchant, a patriot, and a leader who never stopped showing up when his country called. Ladies and gentlemen, America was not built by flawless heroes. It was built by imperfect people who, in extraordinary moments, summoned to extraordinary courage. Among them stood this merchant prince from Boston. What endures about John Hancock is not the size of his signature. It is the size of his resolve. It was the size of his courage. It was the size of his heart. And in the end, The story of John Hancock is the story of America. Bold, defiant, imperfect, and rooted in the belief that no man and no nation should ever bow to tyranny. He drew a line in the sand for a timeless God-given right that free men and free women should govern themselves as Almighty God intended. History, ladies and gentlemen, has his signature. Heaven has his soul. And we have our freedom. Thank you, Governor Hancock, and happy birthday, America. Thank you very much. As usual, if you have any questions, please ask me. If I don't know the answer, I'll make something up. Any questions? Yes. Mr. Mahoney.
The line underneath his signature with loops going through, looks like a pen, but is there any meaning to that?
In those days, well, there was no media up, and everybody corresponded by signatures, and they formalized their signatures as almost a statement about them. So everybody had a little thing there, and actually they even poured wax and stamped, if they had a stamp, and stamped their personal, we would call today the logo or something on it, to personalize that. So you'll find that in that era, a lot of signatures with that on. And that's the best I can do with that question, Ed, but thanks for asking it. Yes, sir, please.
Since he had no heirs, what happened with his fortune upon the death of his wife?
He sure as hell didn't leave it to me, I know that. I do not know that, but I can speculate a little bit that he did have distant family. And in those days, by the way, if a male died, the wife didn't inherit. She didn't get in to speak of it, yes. So I imagine he distributed it among his distant relatives. And I would imagine, as generous as he was, he gave money where it was needed in a new country. That's my speculation. But I would be surprised if I was correct in that. You give anything to me to know that. Yes, ma'am.
What is your next series?
My next series?
Presentation.
Well, thank you for asking that. I am doing, I guess Jack tells me I'm doing on Pearl Harbor Day, Doolittle Raiders. Everybody know about Doolittle Raiders? Come here on Pearl Harbor Day and go get a...
We're not sure if it'll be on Pearl Harbor Day, but it'll be around that time.
Okay.
We'll advertise it.
Yes. So please come. Doolittle Raiders. In the meantime, look it up and don't read too much now. All right? Not just a few words. Yes, sir, please.
Sir, I read somewhere, and I'm vague on this, that King George was willing to pardon everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence, with the exception of John Hancock and Samuel Adams. You happen to know anything about that?
I do know that John Hancock's and Samuel Adams had the highest reward for their capture. They were 1 and 2 on the list for the British to capture and hang, by the way, 1 and 2. But I'll tell you a little more, if you'll allow me here, that before the Declaration of Independence, the committee that Hancock chaired sent what they called at the time the Olive Petition, where they sent the king a letter blaming all his lords and dukes and for the problem, not the king himself. But what happened before the king got that letter? Well, you may recall Lexington and Concord. You may recall Bunker Hill. Well, guess what arrived right before that letter came in the ship? What ship arrived first? The ship with all the dead and wounded from Lexington and Concord, and thousands of them, by the way, and Bunker Hill. The king was so upset, he never read that petition sent to him. It is said he put it in the basket, the, what do you call it? He filed it. What do you call it? The circular file. Thank you, I was looking for that. And never read it. So had he read it and had that ship with the olive branch petition arrive first, who knows what would have happened? Who knows? Yes, sir, please.
When you talk about several of these characters.
Yeah, speak up a little bit, thank you.
You've spoken of several of these characters who have great wealth. How much of their wealth is actually in the states or in the colonies? And how much of it was tied up in England that would have been lost?
I don't think little of any. Now there was some, they had interest in the Caribbean and the colonies and things of that nature. I don't think any was in Britain that I know of. Thank you. That's actually a very good question. Wish I had a better answer. I should have made something up. Anybody else?
Of the 56 men that signed the Declaration of Independence, some of the things that I've read is that 28 of them were either dead within 3 years or lost their entire fortune.
Not only, that is, I believe to be true. One was a general that directed a cannon on his own home because the British were occupying it. Many were killed during the Revolution. Actually, one, I believe, committed suicide because his wife was killed by the British and his children were killed by the British. He couldn't deal with it, so he killed himself. Most of them ended up broke. And these men, generally speaking, were pretty wealthy. Not all of them, but John Hancock may have been the most wealthy. By the way, John Jay was very wealthy as well. But that is probably accurate or very close to being accurate, sir, what you just said. What a price to pay, huh?
Yeah.
This general, who also signed the Declaration, directed a cannon on his own house, not knowing if it was occupied by his family, but he knew the British were there. God bless you all. Thank you so much.